Well, welcome everybody to Question of the Week. This is a Facebook Live session where I take on your science faith questions. And this week's question was inspired by a conversation I had on Facebook a few weeks ago with my friends Steve McCrae and Herman Mays. And the question that we're going to be taking on this week is intelligent design science? Can intelligent design be tested? Can intelligent design be falsified? But before we unpack that question and lay the groundwork for what motivated those questions on the part of Steve McCrae and Herman Mays, I'd like to ask each and every one of you who's watching this broadcast to check in. Take a moment and say hi. Let me know who you are and where you're watching from. This is valuable information for us to have as we plan future broadcasts, but also it's a great way for me to get to know who you are, and I really am interested in knowing who you are. Also, take a moment and react to the broadcast with the like button. The more likes that we get, the more that you interact with this broadcast, the greater the visibility for this broadcast in the Facebook stream. And then finally, I want to know what you think. Is intelligent design science? Can it be falsified? I'm interested in what you have to say on this topic, particularly if you don't agree with my perspective. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and begin to take on this topic. Is intelligent design science? And this all started, again, a few weeks ago after I posted a series of articles where I was discussing the latest results from the ENCODE project, basically making the point that the ENCODE project, which demonstrates that greater than 80% of the human genome displays biochemical activity, that activity translates, in my opinion, largely to function, and that if the human genome is largely functional, again, greater than 80% of the genome is functional, that this undermines the best argument for common descent, the best argument for an evolutionary origin of humanity. And in response to that claim, Steve McCrae and Herman Mays posted a series of questions and engaged in some interaction with me. And I'm going to try to create a composite of the points that they made that motivate this question, again, that we're taking on today, namely, is intelligent design science? So I hope that I am accurately capturing the points that they were trying to make in response to, again, my claim that the ENCODE project undermines the best case for biological evolution. And Steve McCrae and Herman Mays made these points. For example, how does one know God or an intelligent agent purposefully just didn't design our genome that way, that is, to be filled with junk DNA? I still cannot see how junk DNA gives any more credence to the hypothesis of intelligent design or evolutionary processes. It doesn't support either one exclusively nor exclude the other. The bigger issue is posing design as an alternative hypothesis and identifying exactly what predictions such a hypothesis would make. I still would like to know why I should presume that a model based on an omnipotent designer would preclude the existence of junk DNA. And so their point is this, that if you argue that the ENCODE project, again, undermines the best argument for design, and the fact that we're seeing such a large proportion of the human genome displaying functionality, and that again, points to the work of a creator, the handiwork of a creator in constructing the human genome, why would we necessarily exclude the notion that a genome filled with junk, too, couldn't be somehow explained as the work of an omnipotent creator, as the work of an intelligent agent? And I actually am somewhat sympathetic to the points that Herman Mays and Steve McCrae are making. In other words, they're arguing that to say that there is evidence for intelligent design is a meaningless claim because it's ultimately non-falsifiable. And so why would scientists accept this idea of intelligent design at the expense of an evolutionary framework? Because their point is this, that any feature in biology could somehow be construed, could somehow be explained as the handiwork of a creator, regardless of what that feature looks like. And so this leads to the question, is intelligent design really science? Can it be falsified? Can it be tested? And I'm going to ask the question as well, what about evolution? Can evolution be tested? Can evolution be falsified? And so I think if we ask that question of intelligent design, we should also be willing to ask that question of the evolutionary paradigm. So as I take on these questions, I'm going to proceed, first of all, by looking at this question, is intelligent design science? Can intelligent design be a scientific enterprise? And if it is, how would we go about detecting design? And then why would we think that design is a better explanation than, let's say, an evolutionary scenario for explaining the origin and the design and the history of life? Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this question, is intelligent design science? And I think the answer to that question is yes. And the reason why I say that is because there are a number of disciplines in the sciences that are essentially predicated on detecting intelligent agency and the work of intelligent agency in nature. The prime example would be SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a scientific program that's looking for intelligent civilizations in our universe. And the way in which this search is undertaken is to point telescopes at objects in the night sky and examine the electromagnetic radiation emanating from those objects, with the idea that if that electromagnetic radiation is emanating from an intelligent civilization, it is going to have a characteristic signature that will distinguish it from natural mechanisms that are generating that electromagnetic radiation. That is, SETI is inherently an intelligent design program. And the implication is that science has the toolkit to detect the work of intelligent agency in nature. Or let's go to archaeology, particularly when we're talking about the very early archaeological record that produced by hominins, creatures like, let's say, Homo habilis and Homo erectus. Archaeologists feel that they can distinguish between rocks that have been shaped through natural processes and those that have been shaped by intelligent agents, namely by hominins. And in fact, archaeologists will go one step further and actually argue that we can tell something about the capacity, the intellectual capacity of that hominin based on the archaeological record associated with its remains. Or what about the science of crime scene investigation, forensic science? Again, this is an intelligent design program where we see a body lying there and we ask the question, how did that body wind up dead? Was it through some kind of natural process mechanism, or was it through the work of an intelligent agent? And again, those scientists that are working on crime scene investigations can not only tell that intelligent agency was, let's say, responsible for bringing about the death of that individual, but they can tell something about what that suspect might have been, what the perpetrator might have been like, height, weight, handedness, things like that. So I think the first point is this, that intelligent design can be part of a scientific construct. It can be legitimately part of a scientific construct. In fact, it is. Now the question then becomes, how do we go about detecting design? How do we, in a rigorous way, recognize something as being the work of an intelligent agent? And here I'd like to point out the ideas of William Paley, because I think Paley kind of lays the foundation for any kind of work in design detection, where Paley argued that a watch is clearly the work of a watchmaker because it has a set of properties that reflect the work of a mind. And those properties would be that it's made up of parts that interact in a precise way to accomplish a purpose. That is, Paley used the term contrivance to describe a watch. And so, therefore, you would argue that if something in nature appears to be a contrivance, if it appears to have the properties that reflect the type of properties that we would produce as human designers, that we can conclude that those systems have the appearance of being the work of an intelligent agent, that they have the appearance of design. And following in Paley's footsteps in recent years has been the intelligent design movement that have claimed that, again, intelligent design is a scientifically detectable phenomena. So you have people like Michael Behe, who identifies designed systems as being irreducibly complex, composed of a number of parts that interact in a precise way to accomplish a purpose. And that if one of those parts is not functioning properly or is absent, that system lacks function. This is very, very similar to the concept that Paley advanced of biological systems being contrivances, and contrived systems are systems that are designed. Or you have Bill Dembski, who coined the term specified complexity, where Dembski argues that a system can be understood as being designed if there is a pattern that defines that system, if there are characteristics that define that system that exist independent of the system itself, that they seem to be independently specified ahead of time. He calls this specified complexity, which again is a variant of this idea of a contrivance. Doug Axe, in his book Undeniable, talks about functional coherence. Again, I think a similar concept to Paley's idea of a contrivance. In my book, The Cell's Design, I talk about an intelligent design pattern. That is, again, building off of the work of William Paley. Systems that are produced by human beings have certain characteristics. They're irreducibly complex. They are high precision systems. They are optimized systems. They are, in some instances, chicken and egg systems. They contain information. They sometimes are defined by codes. These are properties that reflect the types of things that we produce as human designers. And so when we see this intelligent design pattern in biology, for example, that this could be, again, an indication that this system is designed. And in fact, you could even bring mathematical rigor to this by doing pattern matching, pattern recognition, looking for degree of match, degree of similarity, and even give quantitation to this idea of design detection. Now, of course, evolutionary biologists have argued that design is something that evolutionary mechanisms can produce as well. They can produce systems with the appearance of design. So simply being able to detect evidence for design is in and of itself not enough. We need to go one step further and construct a much more rigorous framework for detecting design. This is something that Bill Dembski did with his explanatory filter, where he argued that you take a particular feature, let's say in biology, and if you cannot explain that feature through natural law or through chance, then you conclude that that system is likely designed if it displays the properties of specified complexity. The way I like to argue for a rigorous determination of design is essentially using an approach that I saw modeled very nicely by a team of archaeologists little over a year ago, when they claimed to have discovered evidence that Neanderthals were present in North America about 130,000 years before modern humans before we made our way into the Americas. Now, this is a highly controversial, contentious claim, but regardless of whether the claim stands or not, the approach that they took to establish design, I think, is really instructive. What these researchers did is they first of all noted that the mammoth remains that they had seen that they detected in this archaeological site and the cobble used to process those mammoth remains had an arrangement that looked as if it was non-natural, that looked as if it was contrived, that looked as if it was designed. But then they went one step further and they pointed out that there were no natural process explanations that seemed reasonable to account for the arrangement of the bones and the cobble. And then finally they went one step further and they went in the lab and they showed that they could produce the fracture patterns on the mammoth bones with the rocks, with cobble, when they applied when they hit, for example, an elephant femur or the femur from a cow. They could produce the same kind of fracture patterns on the bones, striking it with a rock, and create the same kind of striations on the rock as they found in the cobble at the archaeological site. And so in other words, they argued that things appeared to be designed, that there weren't any kind of natural process explanation for those systems, and that they could reproduce those same features that they took to be evidence for design by repeating or constructing things in a laboratory setting. And in my book, The Cell's Design, I argue that biochemical systems have the appearance of design, again, using this intelligent design pattern that's following in the footsteps of Paley's notion of a contrivance. In the book Origins of Life, I argue that the genesis of biochemical systems, and hence the origin of life, currently has no good explanation. And that lastly, when we try to go in the lab and create artificial cells from simple chemical materials, this is the work of synthetic biology, we see that it requires intelligent agency to pull it off. And so in a sense, in these three books, I make a case that it looks as if life must be the handiwork of a creator using a rigorous approach that is modeled after an approach used by these archaeologists to argue that, again, this archaeological site was the product of intelligent agents, and because of the age of the site, it could not be the product of modern humans. It must have been the product of some other hominin, most likely Neanderthals. So the point here is this, that intelligent design is already part of the construct of certain disciplines of science, that there are ways to rigorously determine if something is designed, and that once we determine that something is designed, there is a protocol that we can apply to rigorously determine that design seems to be the best explanation for a particular feature in biology. In this case, let's say for biochemical systems. Now, this is where the point of Steve McCrae and Herman Mays comes into play. Because when you look at systems that appear to be designed, the question then becomes, how do you refute that claim? How do you argue against that particular assertion? Because, for example, people have classically argued that bad designs in biology would not be what we would expect or flawed designs, or designs that are cobbled together would not be things that we would expect if a creator produced that design, but is something we would expect if evolutionary mechanisms produce that design. That is, bad designs count against the case for a creator and would make more sense from the standpoint of a common descent model, particularly now when we're thinking about things like genomes, where we see junk DNA in genomes. Why would a creator produce genomes that have junk DNA? Doesn't it make more sense that this is something that is the product of evolutionary mechanisms, where that junk represents a vestige of the evolutionary history, particularly if those sequences are shared in corresponding locations in corresponding genomes of organisms that would naturally cluster or group together. But the point that Herman Mays and Steve McCrae are making is, but you could always say that maybe the creator isn't omnipotent. Maybe that creator can only produce designs that are flawed in some capacity, that creator can't produce highly idealized designs. Or maybe that creator purposely introduced junk sequences in corresponding locations in genomes for his or her purposes. So you can never refute intelligent design, so therefore they would argue that it really is not part of the construct of science. And this is where I'm actually sympathetic to the point that Herman Mayes and Steve McCrae are making. This is why, at Reasons to Believe, we have been mildly critical of the intelligent design program. Not that we dispute the fine work that's been done to identify features in biology that look like they are designed, and to bring to bear rigorous ways to identify and to determine that the design is, again, the handiwork of a mind. We think that work is very good, but the intelligent design movement is simply trying to argue that that systems are designed, but they're not making any attempt to identify the designer. And therefore, when you look at what comes out of the intelligent design movement, I have seen in response to the claim that biological systems have bad designs, the assertion on the part of some ID proponents that maybe that designer, again, isn't omnipotent, that bad designs don't rule out the notion of design, or that common descent is compatible with the notion of intelligent design. And this is exactly the point that Herman Mayes and Steve McCrae are making. And at Reasons to Believe, what we are doing here is going one step beyond intelligent design. And that is, we are arguing through our creation model approach that there are features in nature that we would expect to see if indeed that intelligent designer is the God of the Bible. And that if the way in which the designer brought about his creative purposes is the way that it is described in Scripture. In other words, we argue that to have ID to be a truly scientifically testable idea, you have to identify who you think the designer is. You have to delineate what you think that designer's characteristics are. You have to make proposals as to what nature would look like if that type of designer produced features in nature. And you even have to construct a historical model a historically descriptive model where you talk about what the sequence of creation must look like and why it's going to look that way. Otherwise, you'd have ID that is potentially a scientific idea, but is fundamentally not falsifiable. The only way you can falsify ID is to identify the designer. And if you think that the designer is the God of the Bible, then you would argue that the designs that we see in biology should reflect the work of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good creator. That is, the design should display an elegance, a sophistication. They should be good designs. And that we would expect to see minimal designs in nature that are flawed. And if we do see a design that is flawed, we have to argue that perhaps that flaw is not an imperfection in nature, but there's a rationale for why things are the way that they are. And that if we understand that rationale, what appears to be a bad design will turn out to be a good design. Also, when we look at the biblical accounts of creation, I believe that they are teaching that God intervened in a direct, personal way to bring about his creative purposes. That is, we would argue that the features that we see in nature that appear to be designed should not be produced by process, but through the direct activity of a creator. That creation should be an event, not a process. Again, this is what my conviction is when it comes to what Scripture teaches. Regardless, what we've done now is we've taken ID as a nebulous concept that is potentially scientifically testable, and we've made it scientifically testable by identifying the designer, the characteristics of the designer, and making very specific predictions about what we would expect to see in nature. That's why Herman Mayes and Steve McCrae, when I look at this claim that a vast proportion of the human genome and the genomes of other organisms is junk, while in my mind, that is incompatible with the Creator being the God of the Bible. It's incompatible with our version of intelligent design, at Reasons to Believe, where we think the designer is indeed the God of the Bible. Moreover, when we see that these so-called non-functional or junk DNA sequences are shared among organisms and they appear in corresponding locations in genomes, then we would argue in that scenario that that makes more sense as reflecting common descent in an evolutionary history for life on Earth as opposed to the handiwork of a creator. That's why, for me, the ENCODE project is so significant, because it's indicating that what we thought to be junk DNA is turning out to have functional utility. And if it has functional utility, then you could argue that that means that it's consistent with the handiwork of a creator, and you could now view shared sequences or shared features in the genome as reflecting shared design, where that creator is employing the same designs in different contexts to accomplish the same kind of purpose, or maybe even different purposes, but purposes that can be accomplished through that very same design feature. And this, of course, is what we do as human beings, as human designers. That's why I would argue that the ENCODE project and other discoveries independent of ENCODE that indicate that that a vast proportion of the human genome appears to be functional is significant for me, and why I would argue it seems to undermine the best argument for evolution. And as I make those statements, I'm not making those statements on the offensive, where I'm making a positive argument for design at that point, but rather what I'm doing is responding to what I think to be the most significant challenge to a creation model view of the origin of life, and specifically the origin of humanity. So I'm operating in a defensive posture where I'm saying that the ENCODE project is now rescuing our creation model from essentially refutation because of, again, these shared junk DNA sequences that we see, quote unquote, in human genomes and the genomes of great apes and other organisms. Now, I would go one step further and argue that the more that we're learning about the human genome, the more sophisticated it seems to be, the more elegant it seems to be, that the systems that are involved in regulating the expression of the information found in the human genome are highly sophisticated systems that now in and of themselves are suggestive of design. In fact, I think it's interesting that some of the best advances in understanding gene regulation networks are coming from system engineers who see the similarity between the design principles they would employ in systems engineering and how the human genome is regulated, and how the genes are interacting with each other in gene regulatory networks, and in gene networks as these networks again are working collaboratively to produce biological features. In fact, you even begin to see systems engineers deriving inspiration from how gene regulation and gene networks work in not only the human genome, but the genomes of other organisms. And along those lines, you can now say that the more that we're learning about the design of the human genome, the more that it appears to be a system that actually displays the properties of a design system. That is, the more that it appears to be a very elegantly contrived system. So, all that to say, I do believe indeed that intelligent design is science, and I do believe that it is testable, that it is falsifiable. But, and again, the point I would make is that intelligent design is already part of the construct of science, that when we look at the features of nature that suggest design, we can even go one step further and actually identify the characteristics or the properties of that designer. For example, when we look at nature, we could argue that the designer is a transcendent personality that has some kind of resonance with the human mind, because, again, the designs that we see in nature mimic the designs that we see human beings make. So we can, with science, not only detect design, but we can also go one step further and get some sense as to what that designer's properties or characteristics are. And I would argue that when we begin to identify who we think that designer is and what kind of features that we would expect that designer to produce in nature, we now render intelligent design falsifiable and therefore truly part of the construct of science. So I hope, Steve McCrae and Herman Mays, that I've properly, that I properly have represented your questions and the key points that I think you were trying to make in our conversation. And if I haven't, I would invite you to jump in and to offer your perspective or to engage the points that I make. And then on top of that, I would, again, invite you to just simply offer your perspective in the comments section. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring things to a close. I'm just going to remind each and every one of you watching to take a moment, check in, say hi, let us know who you are, where you're watching from. Please react to the broadcast with the like button. This increases the visibility of the broadcast in the Facebook feed. And then last but not least, please let me know what you think about these questions. Is intelligent design science? Is it falsifiable? And until next time, I'm going to leave you with this thought. The more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you for your interest in what we do at Reasons to Believe.